Thank you. Actually, the song that people have been playing when I'm introduced these days is Don't Stop Believing. But I appreciate that as well. And that's exactly what I'm going to tell all of you. Don't stop believing. I want to thank you for having me this evening. The waitress came by asking me what I'd selected, and I told her I hadn't selected. I was just in the neighborhood with a tuxedo and saw there was an event, and I didn't know I had to speak. I thought I was just going to get a chance to eat. Chris invited me. I thought, this is great. You know, I want to come into State College, so I'll get a free meal. But for the meal, I have to say a few words. So those of you who know anything about me know that I'm a bit of a shrinking violet. I'm shy, a bit of a recluse. I don't usually say what's on my mind. So tonight I'm going to try to break out of my shell and share a few things with you. The last 3 days I was in California, and yesterday morning at 6:45 I had breakfast with Magic Johnson because he was heading to St. Louis. Some of you know Magic is one of the owners of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And I'm fascinated by Magic Johnson because for a man who's had the sort of success he's had, iconic status, he is as down to earth as you could ever imagine. In fact, it strikes me as though he'd fit in here very well, like so many other Penn Staters, even though he's a Michigan State grad. He comes from a very humble upbringing, two parents who emphasized hard work and commitment. The result of those things would be success, and I think he's a shining example of just that. But he was speaking to me about how important it is for him to leave a legacy, for him to be remembered as someone more than just a basketball player. And I know as we get older, we think about how we're going to be remembered. And I often tell folks that for me, my legacy are my three daughters. My oldest daughter graduated from Smil, as you heard. She actually works for my firm now. My middle daughter is a senior at Brown, and I'll tell you a little story there. She only ever wanted to go to Brown. She was accepted here at Penn State, but only ever wanted to attend Brown. So Brown's a tough school to get into. I don't care who you are. So I went to a friend on McKee Street who has some, at the time, my late friend, who had some connections with Brown, having graduated from Brown a number of years earlier. And his reaction to me was, well, I don't know if it's going to help, but... So Joe wrote a nice letter. And as a result, my daughter was put on, she wasn't rejected initially. She was put in the cubicle they call hold. Now, I also have to tell you that my daughter is an accomplished equestrian. Actually, my two older daughters both are. But this particular daughter has, her last year as a junior equestrian, was a top rider in the United States. And Brown wanted her to ride for their team. Now, unlike many other schools where universities allocate slots for their sports, Brown doesn't do that. And literally, Brown will review each and every applicant. They have a committee, they go through them, they sit in a room. Can you imagine if we did that here at Penn State? We'd still be working on the last 10 years ago. And as a result of that process, she was accepted. And it wasn't by chance. And it was because we did have some assistance from a man who left behind a great legacy. And it was that legacy that brought me to where I am today as far as the Penn State community is concerned. And people ask me, why are you involved in this? Why did you become so engaged? Truth of the matter is, I was like probably most of you before any of this happened. It's Happy Valley. We were all very comfortable and complacent. Our governance was, as we were being told, world class. And then that ill-fated evening, November of 2011, we learned maybe that wasn't the case. And I was so outraged that night by the way we'd handled this. The next day, by chance, I was traveling to State College with my youngest daughter, now a freshman at Maryland, because she was attending a rap concert at the Bryce Jordan Center. So I drove her, I went in, and I left and went over to the Nittany Lion Inn. That was November the 10th, the night after, and ran into many of the now colleagues of mine on the Board of Trustees. I had very frank conversations with them. And then as the days unfolded, I watched Franco Harris, a man I didn't know, but peripherally, stand out, have the courage of leadership to let us all know this was wrong, that we were all entitled to due process. And I agreed with him completely and totally. And so I reached out to Franco. It took about 2 weeks. A little story there. I didn't have Franco's number, but was able to get it through a mutual friend. And I called Franco on his cell. As you can imagine, Franco's a busy man. And it went to his voicemail. Problem is that Franco never really cleans his voicemail. He doesn't clear it out. So the voicemail box was full. I couldn't leave a message. I did this for days. Till one day, miraculously, someone had cleared his voicemail box. As I learned later, it was his wife, Dana. And I left a voice message. And the next day, a Friday, I received a call from Dana. Franco was in a meeting, but he would call me, probably be several hours. Several hours later, I got a call again from Dana. She said he's still in that meeting. As it turned out, it was a meeting with the mayor of Pittsburgh. You all know that story. The next day, Saturday, Franco called me, and I spoke with him for almost 2 hours. And we began to develop a plan. I thought I could offer my name because I had a platform. Most of you know the name because of the baseball stadium. That was never my plan, but it worked out. And Franco, of course, had the notoriety. People were interested in speaking to Franco. The only question was, would I become so engaged that I would seek a seat on the Board of Trustees? Franco and I discussed exactly how we would handle that, and we decided that Franco would better serve the Penn State community in his current role, and I would take a shot at running for the Board of Trustees. I have a bit of a background in communications as well. I've owned some media properties, so I knew a little bit about television. Actually, I know a lot about television. So I knew that our opportunity to use media to our advantage would play a large role in whether or not we could have success in achieving our goal, which was to get a seat on the Board of Trustees. As fate would have it, I was elected, but not before, as many of you know, the Philadelphia Inquirer attempted to smear me. The Sunday after Blue-White 2012, the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer had a story. It said, "Polarizing figure emerges in race for Penn State trustee." And Penn State, in its infinite wisdom with its leadership, had decided that they were going to involve themselves in what I call a smear campaign. That being that Penn State's then advisor, Lanny Davis, who some of you may recognize, the man who helped former President Bill Clinton during his troubles with then intern Monica Lewinsky. Lanny Davis is best known for that great line, it depends on what definition of the word is. Right? Lanny Davis thought the way to get rid of this guy Lubrano was to smear him. So what they did was they shared information, in many respects on an anonymous basis. It's typically how these stories are run. And I have a thick skin, so I knew no trick would be too low for many of these people because they didn't want anyone upsetting the apple cart. What I didn't expect, though, was that it would get very personal. And there was a mention in the story, something that was going on with my divorce at the time. And I could handle that, but my 3 daughters didn't handle it quite as well. It really made me mad. But that's when I realized how great the Penn State community is. And let me explain to you why I say that. Franco Harris called me up that Sunday morning. He said, "Anthony, you see the story?" I said, "No. What are you talking about? I saw a story about something else." I said, "No, man, I'm pissed off." And in the story, they represented that the night Joe passed away, the night we had the memorial service for Joe, we came back here to the Nittany Lion Inn and we're in whiskers. There were members of the free investigative team present, and I had a chance encounter with them, and I was belligerent and appeared to be intoxicated. Well, many of you learn that I really don't drink, so it's awfully hard to become intoxicated except with life. So that was a complete lie. But then they went on to say that Franco Harris had intervened to separate us. Well, they interviewed Franco, and Franco said that never happened. Of course, they downplayed that. So Franco was really upset with how they depicted him. And in that same story, there were anonymous sources from athletics who suggested that I didn't treat women very well. Having 3 daughters, it struck a really sensitive chord, I have to tell you. But what really bothered me was the fact that the sources were anonymous. Now, the sources came from within athletics. I won't say anything more than we have some leadership challenges in this university in a number of our departments. But when that anonymous source made those misrepresentations, that really pissed me off. And then when 2 of the standing board members commented on my quote-unquote behavior, I thought, how inappropriate. We're in the middle of a campaign, and we have board members commenting. They know nothing about the facts, but as I've learned, I never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Penn State community, though, responded interestingly enough in a way that made me realize what Joe had said. And people asked Joe, why did you stay so long? He said, look around, look around. That morning, that Sunday morning, Franco Harris said to me, Anthony, you don't do anything. You don't respond, you don't react, you do nothing. We'll handle it. The Penn State community shut down the Philadelphia Inquirer online. They shut them down with all of their comments because they knew it was a smear. And in fact, I probably got more votes because of that story. People who wouldn't have voted for me, who said, you know, if they're trying that hard to keep him off, we want him on. That's how I realized how great this community is. That I didn't have to do a thing. That you had my back. And as I traveled the country for the last year and a half as a board member, I hear the same thing everywhere I go. I've done 16, 17 Alumni Association events at different chapters. And no one's sitting there telling me, hey, you know what? They got it right. We're going to move on. People want the truth. What happened? How did it happen? That's all we ever wanted, right? The truth. And I can tell you this. The story, the narrative, completely and totally untrue. The only question is, why haven't we stood up to defend the institution? We now know from the lead prosecutor in the Sandusky case that so far as he has no evidence to suggest that Joe was involved in a cover-up of any kind. I told us from the beginning that, knowing Joe as I knew Joe, that there wasn't an ounce of DNA in his body that would have allowed him to do something like that. And all of you know it too, because you watched him for 61 years. The only question is, why didn't our leadership stand up and say the same thing? And I have a theory on that, and the theory is that from a political correctness standpoint, it was much too difficult for our business and industry trustees, the chairmen of Merck and U.S. Steel and Mellon Bank of New York, to stand in front of that political correctness issue and defend the institution, because then they might be charged with defending a pedophile because they're incapable of separating the two. Due process, something we should all protect. But we didn't do that. So we got rid of these guys, and then we decided we need to vindicate ourselves. So we're not going to investigate. We're going to justify. And that was my argument with Freeh's report before it was issued. I'd heard from talking to so many people who were interviewed that they weren't asking questions about Jerry Sandusky. They were asking Joe Paterno questions. Did Joe have any influence over your budget? Did Joe have any influence over people you hired? Did Joe do this? Did Joe do that? I have members of my board who'd say to me, well, Joe had to know. Heck, he knew right down to the pencils in the inkwell. He just had to know. He was the most powerful guy at Penn State. Here's a story. Baseball stadium that bears my name is in a location that Joe Paterno did not want. In fact, he fought hard to prevent it from being built there. He went to the state legislature, tried to influence their decision to give us $13 million, because he didn't want it there. He did not want that stadium there. In fact, the first time Joe really yelled at me was in 2005 in Atlantic City. He was in a side room. We were having an event at Maxwell Football Club. Joe came out. Some of you might know that Joe liked to have a sip or two of favorite beverage. And by this time, he had a couple of sips. So he came out of the side door and he spied me across the room and he looked over and he said, "I'm mad at you! I'm mad at you!" Actually, because he's left-handed. And as he walked over to me, he said, "I didn't want that stadium there. I know it wasn't your fault, but I told him I didn't want it there." It impacted football parking. He didn't want it there. In fact, it wasn't supposed to be there. I had nothing to do, by the way, with where they put it. In fact, I had nothing to do with anything except making the gift. So for a man with so much power and so much influence, he couldn't stop that, couldn't stop the visitor center from being built. So that's a misconception that people have, that Joe had all of this power. Well, the power Joe had was the power over us, just in terms of the fact that he lived his life a certain way. He didn't control the budgets at Penn State. But I think all of you already know that. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So the question is, why didn't our leadership defend the institution? I'm on the board now since July 2012. My first board meeting was July 12th. Most of you remember that that day Louis Freeh came out with a report. We spent $8.3 million. I've asked for our money back because it was as bad a report as there could ever be in terms of lack of evidentiary matter to support conclusions. But that day, July 12th, I rode from the hotel, Lackawanna Radisson, over to our meeting site. I don't think I've ever seen as many media as we had that day. Freeh had given his press conference in Philadelphia earlier in the morning, and so many of the media traveled to our site. And I rode with Karen Peets, then the board chair. I have to tell you that in January of 2012, I met privately with Karen Peets and Keith Mosser, then chair and vice chair. I was not a member of the board. It was before Joe passed, and I gave him a simple piece of advice. I said, if you want to heal this community quickly, what I would recommend you do is you walk over to Joe's house, you apologize to him for the way this was handled. He will find a magnanimous way to accept your apology, and he will walk out hand in hand, and that will send a message to our community that all is well, we're going to be fine. But instead, we lacked the courage, as I call it, because we were concerned with what Freeh might say or what the children's advocacy groups might say. So instead of defending the institution, we took the path of least resistance, which was to damn the people who were gone. So again, July 12th, I'm riding with Karen Peets. And Karen shared something with me that proved to be very insightful for me. She told me that when she was a field hockey player here in the early 70s, the advent of Title IX, for those of you with historical perspective, she said that she thought we had a culture problem at Penn State. Culture problem. I guess it was easy for her to accept what Louis Freeh said. So fast forward 10 days later, we get a consent decree, and has been widely reported. Mark Emmert held a gun to Rod Erickson's head. You might be interested to know, by the way, that on Rod's ride home from our board meeting in Scranton that Friday the 13th, Mark Emmert called, and he said, "My board is inclined to impose the death penalty." How would Rod know whether that was true? Well, if you read the affidavits filed by the NCAA in response to our lawsuit, something very interesting. Mark Emmert in his affidavit says that the first time he actually spoke to his board was the following Tuesday. I guess he was playing poker. we shouldn't be surprised that that was an untruth that he told Rod Erickson. Nevertheless, I was livid the day that the consent decree was signed because I wasn't part of the process. How could we sign an agreement that binds this university without consulting our full board? Who gave you this advice? So I demanded a meeting. That was Monday, and we had that meeting on the 2 days later on Wednesday over at the Penn Stater. And during that meeting, there were a number of us who really wanted to take this to the full board and have a vote. But it became abundantly clear that might not be in our best interest in the long term, because too many people were of the opinion that what's done is done. So from a legal standpoint, probably was better for us not to have a vote by the board, because the argument is that we've never consented to it as a full board. But as we learned later, the executive committee had a conference call. We don't know how many members of the executive committee were on that call, but on that call, they deferred the authority, they ceded the authority to the chair and vice chair, Karen Peets and Keith Mosser. So the direction that they gave Rod Erickson was, you just have to talk to them. And my understanding is that Karen said, Rod, you do what you think is right. Well, one of my colleagues on the board, Ryan McCumbee, a Navy SEAL, retired Navy SEAL, he's about due process, he's about accountability, he's about leadership, and he didn't like that. So quietly he filed an appeal with the NCAA on his behalf and on the behalf of other like-minded trustees. That followed the appeal that had been filed by former players and by the estate of Joe Paterno. Of course, we all knew that they were going to deny our appeals, and they were going to argue that we had no right to appeal because in the consent decree we waived our legal rights. I think that's going to come back to help us, frankly. So knowing that that was going to be denied, and it was, we then embarked on the lawsuit that's in front of the courts today. And on October 29th, we got our opportunity to make our oral arguments in front of a very, very thoughtful judge, Judge Lee. And I expect that'll be about a 2-hour hearing, and I expect within a short period of time the judge is going to rule whether we have standing to move forward in the case. If we get standing in the case, I think we're going to be able to uncover quite a bit of information that will shed light on what happened, how it happened. Because I think, as I said from the outset, I think we're all interested in the truth. We want to know what happened. And I think we're all amazed by the fact that our leadership acted the way they did. You know, my mother died December 2nd, 2011. And not long after, in the mail came a handwritten note. And I saw the return address was McKee Street, so I knew it was Sue. And she wrote such a heartfelt note to me. And I thought to myself, in the midst of all of their angst, she found the time to send me a note because she knew that I was suffering. I'll leave you with this thought because I don't want to take any more time than I've already taken. But January 10th, I had the opportunity to go visit with Joe, which was 12 days before he died. He'd come home from chemo, he was lying in bed, and we're talking. And I said, Joe, there are some positive side effects of all of this. So one is that there's a greater societal awareness of this issue of pedophilia and child molestation. It's far more prevalent than anyone really understands or wants to discuss. And I said, secondly, you brought together a Penn State community in a way that no one else could have. I'm talking to people all over the world. I get emails from servicemen and women in Afghanistan to this day asking me to continue to fight. And as only Joe could, and this is the essence of Joe Paterno, and all of you know this, but I'm going to share this with you. Joe had been sitting up in bed. Well, he leaned forward with that left hand, and he said, hey, this isn't about me. This is about our school. This is about leaving it a better place than we found it. That was Joe Paterno. So when I started this evening, I said Magic Johnson's concern was what his legacy might be. Well, we all know what Joe's legacy is. We all know it. We know it in our hearts. And I'm involved in this because I want to right a wrong. Before I'm done, we'll not only have a statue back out in front of Beaver Stadium, but we're going to honor Joe Paterno at Paterno Field at Beaver Stadium with 106,000 people. Because we are. Thank you.